So I'm Mary Strode. I've been in statistical development in the developing world for over 30 years, and Matthew asked me to come along today to tell you a few stories. So I hope I don't get carried away with the anecdotes because I only have 10 minutes. The title of my presentation is Are We Winning? And this is a personal view, a very personal view of what we might be missing, and I'd be very happy to have some dissenting voices. So my first slide, and I don't know whether you can see it. Where do we start? I've used the World Bank Stats Capacity Indicator, which I know has a lot of critics, but it gives you a time series from 2005 to 2017 for all the countries in which the World Bank has an involvement via concessionary lending. And you can see that really nothing much has changed. It was, the overall score was 67 out of 100 in 2005 and 68 in 2017. So it's not a great success story at first sight. Then we go a little further. This is taken from, I don't know whether you can even see that, but it's about the amount of data that's available in terms of time series. I can't read it either. Increasing over time in the number of MDG indicator series for which trend analysis was possible for developing countries. And the, probably Claire can tell me more about this, but...
I recognise that.
Yeah, so there's the point is really not to explain the graph, but just to say that there seems to be some more data out there. But the question is that capacity? Now, going back to Matthew's instruction that I need to tell you a story, I'm going back now through my own career. And I started back in the 80s in Vanuatu. And I was having a little chat with Matthew on Skype the other day to say how nice things were in Vanuatu, because I'd come from the New Towns Commission and I pitched up and there was a fairly normal office and it ran in the normal way and it had a budget. And we had a relatively sort of small scope of statistics and people got on with their work. But there was also a large number of British, Australian and New Zealand officials holding key positions in government. So when I went off to in the 90s to Zambia, I got a bit of a shock because what I found there was a very dilapidated statistical system. But what had happened was that the training that we did in the 80s had actually fed through to a really quite talented cadre of young statisticians, all raring to go in a completely collapsed office. And at that point, the development agenda was about focusing on Ceres-Pacific technical cooperation. We were embedded there, we were part of the office, and I think we set up a new CPI, which is still running. We set up national accounts, we set up a number of other things. It seemed, we seemed to be doing good. Then in the mid-90s, something happened, because at that time we weren't funding any of the project costs of statistical development. We weren't funding any of the field costs. At that point, we started to get the large multilateral donors coming in and funding field costs for a series of surveys, living standards surveys, the mixed surveys, the DHS. This was a game changer. The whole flavour of the office changed. I won't say too much about that, but it was a game changer. Then moving into the 2000s, we had the Paris Declaration. We had new ways of thinking about development assistance. We started to talk about country ownership. We started to talk about donors being aligned with one another to support country priorities. And we started to talk about mutual accountability. And this is where the indicators came in. We had the poverty reduction strategy papers, which were heavily dependent on indicators. And we statisticians thought the world had changed. And Tony Williams, Chief Statistician in DFID, sent me into OECD to establish a new initiative, which turned out to be Paris 21. So this was to really be at the heart of the new drive for getting data for indicators. This was to be a game changer. And the answer was thought to be more money. So let's move on a little bit. By the 2010s, I'd left Paris 21, still going strong, thanks. And I moved to the private consulting world. Here we focused on statistical modernization, statistical quality, statistical regulation, etc., etc. We're starting to take the system-wide issues quite seriously. Now we have the data revolution and technical challenges surrounding that. Now I was lucky enough, whilst I was at OPM, to do a number of quite big evaluations of statistical capacity building. The first one, which Emily tells me they still use, is the one that Matthew and I participated in, which was an evaluation for the Paris Declaration on statistical capacity building. And I think our main finding, the main takeaway, was that the political economy, the enabling environment, was the most important aspect. In other words, what's going on, what's the political demand for statistics, what kind of environment is the Statistics Office working in. Then a little later on, I was asked by the UN Joint Inspection Unit in 2016 to do a UN independent sector-wide evaluation with very little money, and we did a number of case studies across the world. And our takeaway, and we've got into trouble for saying this, is that statistics has become an extractive industry for the international community. They're paying for it, and they're using it, and statistics have become increasingly detached from the governments in which they sit. And we also found that there was very little attention being paid to getting statistics actually used in country. I'll say a little bit more about that later on. A lot of focus on putting in IT platforms, but that is not the same as getting data used. And then I'm also going to refer, because I thought Mike Hughes might be here, to an evaluation we did in Uganda for the Ugandan Bureau of Statistics of their NSS development. Now, in the early 2000s, the Uganda Bureau of Statistics was thought to be a miracle. They turned around a collapsed, dilapidated office into what was then a thriving, functioning office. And everyone pointed to regulation and the fact that it was now an independent agency as the key to success. So then everybody else in Africa and around the world started to copy that. Did it work? So I think, because I've only got 10 minutes, that I think there are 3 assumptions that we all have that might be hindering us. And our assumptions come from the fact that we are a statistical community which is originated in the developed world, and we tend to think that when people go to the Statistics Office, that things surrounding them are going to be pretty much the same. So our assumption is that statisticians' job is to satisfy user demands. Now, what we found in many of our evaluations and in our working life is that national demand might not even be there. So whose demand are we satisfying? If the international community is dominating the demands, then which users are we to satisfy? Are we to satisfy the national non-users, or are we to satisfy the international users who are paying for stuff? And again, I think probably there's a missing group of people in government, and there were a lot of them in Rwanda, the ODI fellows, principally economists, who sit within ministries and who are excellent at using data and number crunching. And one of the questions I've asked myself, because we spent 12 years supporting statistics in Rwanda and it seemed to be a huge success, was besides the president being very keenly in data, what else was it? And Matthew put his finger on that. In fact, that there were all these economists sitting in ministries, crunching numbers, getting it used in policy. But other than that, it's become a bit of a tick box indicator exercise. Gone up, gone down, stayed the same. There's been little thought about using statistics to answer the hows and the whys. Now, who is doing that in countries? At the same time, we've had this parallel profession set up. Mike, I remember you coming with me to the Ministry of Water Affairs in Kampala. And we asked to see the statistical unit. And a man came out and he said, I've got no job anymore. What do you mean you've got no job anymore? He said, well, I haven't got anything to do. So we inquired a little more deeply and we found that there was a brand spanking M&E unit which was now doing the work of the statistician. So the old, tired, worn-out statistician was sitting doing nothing, and there were people in new suits doing M&E. Now, were these M&E people part of the NSS? I don't think they were they, Mike? No. So there was a whole new bunch of people taking on this role of using data and thinking about it and what it meant for policy that was outside the statistical domain. People had stolen our clothes. This is what Mike thought. And then the other thing we found in Uganda was the civil society. Do you remember the civil society group that had been trained in statistics and were constantly being locked up by the police and chased around Kampala? You know, we don't have a thriving academic or research community in developing countries, and those people that try get locked up. So here we are presenting really quite a sad user story. Where are these users in country? I think Matthew probably has got something to elaborate on that later, some recent experience from Nigeria. And are we mistaken in drawing our boundary at the edge of the NSS? Should just stopping at disseminating our results really be where we stop? And should we focus on turning potential users into users? Now, we know very little about who the users are in developing countries, and I got on to Rwanda, who I understood had kept some quite good statistics about hits on their website. And it turns out that most of the hits on the website are, one, Rwandese young school leavers or graduates wanting jobs, and two, international students wanting data for their projects. Second assumption. There we go. A couple of minutes left. Okay. Weak planning is the problem. Weak planning is the problem. And I'm probably responsible for this because we had some of the first statistical planning workshops for SADC countries in Lusaka in the year 2001. Perhaps weak planning is the problem. Now, we have to realize that in most developing countries, all they get is their recurrent budget, and that just pays for the salaries. And largely, these aren't dispersed on time. I remember in the Zambian statistics office, the cry went up, money has come. Everyone would shoot out of their office and run to the director's office to try to get some funding for their project. How can you plan in a situation like that? Finance ministries rarely understand why data collection is so expensive. And almost nobody else does. Even people from the West that I've worked with don't understand why data is so expensive. Now, looking into the future, the recruitment of ICT skills. I don't know whether, Matthew, you remember Ethiopia. They were unable to attract any IT people because the government job description demanded a master's degree in IT, and they were paying peanuts. Obviously, the private sector swamped out. I'm happy to say that last time I used Ethiopia as a case study, they had 6 data platforms supplied by 6 different donors. And okay, let's move on a little bit, because I've only got a few minutes left. The third assumption that may be hindering us, that stronger regulation is the solution. I think we learnt by some previous good practice in the enlargement of the EU that the acquis that required statistical regulation for member states joining the EU was the solution to improving statistics. And we also thought that the Uganda miracle was the solution, that if we made statistics offices independent, then we would solve the problem. Now, most countries have excellent regulations, laws, codes of practice, quality standards, etc. But in a weak civil service environment, a weak regulatory environment, how can those laws be enforced? One last anecdote, if I may. Gambia Bureau of Statistics, and I apologize to anyone who's listening from these countries, but I think it just helps inform those listening. They had some very excellent memoranda of understanding between government departments and the National Statistics Office. These were agreed, they were signed by the permanent secretaries. When the National Statistics Office went to try and get that data, it didn't matter that the permanent secretaries had signed them, the data wasn't going to be given away. And I'm sure Matthew's had similar experiences in Nigeria. The fact that you've got a regulation doesn't mean that you can enforce it. So it's necessary, particularly for new data sources, but it isn't the solution and it isn't sufficient. And
I think perhaps if that's a good moment to stop, Mary.
Just last slide.
Okay.
Please, can we broaden our horizons? Thank you.
Thank you so much to the Royal Statistical Society for co-hosting this event with us. I mean, it's great, and also thanks to all the people who helped make it happen. I think it's the second or third time that we have a joint event here in this room, so it's great. I will not say so much words about Paris 21, just saying it stands for Partnership in Statistics in Development in the 21st Century. It's an abbreviation, and our main role is to sort of strengthen national capacities in data and statistics in low-income countries. And well, I mean, let's move to the topic, and I was actually very glad that Mary spoke before me, because many of the things that she was alluding to, you will find in one or the other way also in my presentation. So the title slightly changed. I wanted to say a few words about developing guidelines, and I would be really very interested. This is a learning session. I hope I can learn also something. I can take something home. We have a couple of brochures, hopefully still out there. And getting your feedback on these guidelines, on new approaches to capacity development, that would be great for us as we go forward. So I have 4 quick points. I will say a few words about these capacity development 4.0. Introduce very sort of as a sketch out the guidelines, then answer the question why at all new guidelines, which will pick up on many things that Mary already mentioned, and then a few questions to you, hopefully to inspire discussion later on. So Why do we start? I mean, why is thinking about capacity development interesting? And I think the starting point here is this is a reflection that is not only relevant to data and statistics and many points that Mary made and I will be making. It's a general reflection in development cooperation and in development to step back and think, hey, we have done 20 years of training. We spent a lot of money on building capacities in countries. Building, we labeled it, not developing. What do we get out of it? Do we actually track the results? Is it getting better? And there is a sort of a critical reflection, and there's a very good ODI paper that was questioning all the money spent from DFID and from German GIZ and from AfD on capacity development or building, and was questioning, is it actually only training? And how do we deal with all these sticky issues that Mary was also referring to changing the institutional environment and so on. So there is an overall reflection. So we started actually at the UN World Data Forum. UNWDF stands for UN World Data Forum. So we had a Paris 21 organized a track, and there were first reflections and thinking about what does it mean in data and statistics. Now then we have a couple of, we actually invited people deliberately not coming from the statistical or data community, from the German Development Institute. These are people who work more on development cooperation. Stefan Klingelbiel is very much associated in this sort of development cooperation business, financing for development. And so we asked them to produce a paper for us. What can they bring to us? And there's a very interesting paper saying, yes, it's important to look at it. We have a couple of ideas, but I mean, you have to think it through. You have to go yourself the extra mile. And then with many partners, we are currently doing this. Then we had a very interesting, so we set up at the Paris 21 2017 meeting, Neil was there. We set up sort of task teams. Some of you were part of these task teams. And we started to work on it, on conceptualization, on measurement, and on practical examples. And then we had a workshop in December last year to bring it all together, and sort of many things I share here are part of, have come out of this. Then the other very interesting thing, more and more abbreviations, I'm very sorry. HLG stands for High Level Group. Forget about that. This is for partnership, cooperation, and capacity development. It's a UNSC, United Nations Statistical Commission group. It's a high-level group supporting the SDG implementation. Maybe you have heard about the Cape Town Action Plan. And so we were sending out a questionnaire to all heads of statistics to assess what are their needs. What is the needs from a country perspective and their own evaluation, thinking about capacity development. And a few results I will present in a minute. And last but not least, that's where we are today. We have a few sort of thinking about these guidelines, want to get your feedback, and this will then hopefully end in some way or form. We will set up, we will produce an annual report about assessing capacities, a global flagship report on capacity, statistical capacity assessment, and we will also pull together a sort of data knowledge bank and platform where we will showcase good examples, good practices around how we can actually improve capacities. So with this, I already showed the video. I just wanted to say, in terms of thinking about capacity development 4.0, we can engage in the discussion later on if 4.0 makes sense or not. But I think the main point here is, in the past, I mean, it's important to look at maybe two different things. One is the targets, one is the levels. When we think about capacity development, we have often in the past, we're thinking about the individuals, strengthening Johannes's capacities, Ian's, Claire's. That was, I mean, getting up to speed with stuff. Flying in consultants, training us, that was that. Then we a little bit on the organizational level, and about the RSS, about the statistical office in Tanzania, Uganda, a little bit about how they function, but not that much, and then hardly anything about the governance, the regulation, the political economy of the things that were sort of shaping, some of these things are shaping those other things. So we hadn't had, because it's tricky, it's difficult, and we didn't, well, politics, so we didn't feel very comfortable to look into, and I think you made a couple of very good points also here. And on the targets, I mean, money, resources, how we can sort of, what we will strengthen, how budgets are run within sort of the system, the skills and knowledge, management, the politics and power, and last but not least, incentives. Why should people behave in a statistical office or from the user side as they do, because they respond to certain either financial or other incentives, and often we didn't really look what that means. I give you one example on the incentive side, the famous per diem. So you have been all in the field, that's why. For those in the field who know, well, I mean, it's a merry-go-round, people who sign up for trainings because the per diem is quite interesting. People are in the field, they are not in the office. They do all the data collection for the international agencies, which takes the data away. Nobody sits in the sort of capital, does the data work. So those kind of misincentives has been an issue. You guys have been seeing it in the field, but it has been difficult to sort of make it, to speak openly about it, because it's a slightly tricky issue. So coming already to the guidelines. So why do we think guidelines could help? And for whom could those guidelines be? The first thing, the first thing to recognize is for our development partners, it's important to see the wide range of capacities that we would need to strengthen. Often development partners think very narrowly about building or developing capacities, and it's a broad range of issues that we come to in a minute. There are a few things, these new areas that we have to look at, and I will give a few examples in a minute. We are living in a very different world, in the 4.0 world, with digitalization, with data revolution, with more and more actors, with civil society, citizen-generated data. This is a very different world than just from a couple of years ago. So how do national statistical systems adapt and evolve? How do the NSS or the NSO adapt to this sort of new challenges or opportunities? And last but not least, every kind of program has three phases. I mean, you have the sort of design phase, you have the implementation phase, and you have the monitoring and evaluation phase. And I think some of these capacities development has to be thought through those lines. Now, for whom are they? And this is, I mean, in the beginning when we had the workshop, there was a slightly, I had people, we had maybe 60, 70 people coming, and there were people from national statistical offices, and that's where Paris 21 is operating in. So we often talk to NSO heads or people who work for UNECE or for RSS or for many other supporting agencies. And then you have the 8 people. And you have the people from the development cooperation side. And Eurostat is something, they have technical people, but many, like Switzerland and others, and DFID is also actually an exception in that sense, because you have a statistical cadre who understands, but in many other parts there is this sort of development people side. So we have donors and we have the beneficiaries, and I think these guidelines should be for both. So if you are an NSO head somewhere and you want to sort of use the guidelines, you get some good ideas of how you can improve your own statistical system, while hopefully also 8 agencies will have a good look and sort of take them on board. Now, the other thing is in terms of the, I think it's important to differentiate between having a framework that I just presented to you and how you get to that framework. I mean, that's the guidelines. I mean, how do you develop capacities to get to sort of these capacity development 4.0, which is mainly focusing then on cooperation projects. So, as I mentioned, and we can then go more into detail maybe in the discussion, the guidelines as they are, and we have sort of developed them even more granular than I can present now, around the 3 things: design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. And then on the other side, we have the 5 problems areas: the costing and financing, the incentives and political economy that you were referring to, we already heard about, consultation and coordination, non-technical skills and business processes, and then what's hardly it's not existing, is always results-oriented community of practices. That's something that's often neglected, and that's something I think that these guidelines should encourage, to build these results-oriented community of practices. Now you may ask, what does non-technical skills mean? I think there's another thing that has come out through looking at data and statistical guidelines, is that we have often trained people on technical skills. Data and statistics, by first thing people would think about data scientists, about R, about SPSS, but maybe not so much about change management, about building sort of skills for leadership, and about those soft skills which, if you are running a statistical office, and I have I have, as we talk about examples, I have the example of Lisa Bersales in mind. She's the chief statistician of the Philippines. So she runs an office of maybe 2,000 or more employees scattered around of how many islands has the Philippines? 2,000 islands or so. So they sit in very different places. She sits in Manila and she has to run this thing. And without any sort of, skill training of her leadership skills, of her change management skills, it's very, very difficult. I mean, Philippines does a fantastic job, and if you are there, so I was looking at, or thinking about your presentation, and I think many things that were presented was very Africa specific. I mean, I've seen many Asian countries, and Philippines, of course, is very on the other side. You have seen so many young statisticians and data analysts that have come with strong skills and that have also the rules and regulation in place where it can work. But it's certainly a different environment. So I think for me, Philippines is always something that's sort of where we can look and gear towards to, and the question is, how did they come to that place? Anyway, so the non-technical skills, we also have to think about how we can develop those. I already mentioned some time consciousness.
You're fine.
Yeah, I'm fine.
Yeah.
So this is just to run to two examples of the guidelines. One is the design phase. You have, and this is also then important for the measurement of outcomes. I mean, if we have all these statistical assessments, but if it's not put in for monitoring evaluation, you can't really, you have to think it really through. So broaden the scope to evaluate non-technical skills and other business processes. Then the implementation phase, and then Michael Woolcock, he's not a great fan, and I'm not sure whether he's already listening, about these best practices. That's the sort of development jargon, do best practices, and then you go from Rwanda to Kenya, and then you move on, and you just... No, we tend to talk about good practices. I think there could be a starting point, but encourage experimentation. I mean, the local context might be very different in each country, and but looking at some sort of joint patterns, I think make a lot of sense, but don't impose it, and now you have to take and implement everything. And then this soft skills component in the evaluation of national strategies for in our NSDS framework. So this should be really thought through and should be added to the guidelines. And then the other thing that is slightly new, and we heard about it, and then we can go maybe in the discussion more in detail how it can be done. The key actors, I think, who are the key actors that sort of shape and drive success in the data production and statistical side? You have to be very aware about this, and this might be nowadays also citizens. I mean, citizens also produce data. So how do you relate, or the private sector, the mobile phone companies, how do you relate to this? Local structure, and then assess initial objectives and deviations and purpose as sort of in terms of the M&E phase. I have to say, as you mentioned, the Paris Declaration of Aid Effectiveness, I'm personally a bit worried that just 5 or 10 years ago, I wasn't yet with Paris 21, so I was working as a development economist, and that was a time when the Accra agenda came, so a lot of pushback for national systems. Donors sort of should report to one system, and we should align to national. We are currently seeing a completely backslash. We are currently seeing just the opposite. So each donor starts to up its own system, and obviously for the value of money discussion and showing that British money goes to sort of helps, German money helps, French money helps, they set up their own systems, and we are just going, it seems that like we've gotten about 10 years for arguably reasons we have to relate to. I mean, we have to understand that taxpayers look very critically now. But we shouldn't throw all the lessons out that we have had over the last years. So in data and statistics, it's slightly worrying how we are sort of backtracking. And I think maybe through sort of reminding donors of how they can do better and maybe can combine both things, having good data for reporting purposes, but also strengthening systems would be important. Now, very quickly, so this is a sort of sketch out what I wanted to do. Normally you would do it the other way around. You would do first the motivation and then the sketch out, but I thought it's important that this sticks, and then you tell me about the time. And this, again, joins very up what Mary already presented to you. Why do we need it? First, there are sticking issues. So there are issues that haven't been dealt with the existing capacity development. There are ignored aspects, and there are new priorities for the NSO. I just wanted to, this is coming out from the survey that we sent around that I mentioned in the beginning to national statistical offices all over the world. And so I think it was maybe 70 or 80 responses all over the sort of from lower, so this is sort of in terms of the income of countries. And then in terms of, the question was, do the programs, in terms of the support programs, these programs, were they led and monitored by my country? And you can see, not very surprising, in low-income countries, many people disagreed, so that those programs, capacity development programs, have been mainly driven by donors, while obviously in the rich countries, in the UN, in the OECD countries, they were led by the donors themselves, so by the countries themselves. So basically, in poor countries, it's the donors who basically decides what's going on, and in rich countries, it's the other way around. And we have seen this, I mean, you have plenty examples from this. Speaking about omission of users, this joins, I mean, Mary already said it, from a few evaluations about capacity building projects, the World Bank, the user perspective. We have often forgotten about the user perspective, the demand for data, and why is demand maybe low or not low. I think that's something we should discuss. Is there low demand or is there low latent demand? I would say maybe as an economist there's latent demand. We have to make it effective. They want to have data, but maybe it's just not there. And then there is these information days by decision makers. Ignored aspects, political, I have said that. Very interesting, there is a publication that has just come out from the IDB, from the Inter-American Development Bank, about the political economy of Statistical. I think they just launched it. And this is, I think, because you also mentioned the EU are key. And the interesting question is why the World Bank, though they sort of promoted the data production and wanted to sort of have countries that once the data is produced, this data will be shared with them and will be made open, countries didn't do it. And why maybe EU accession countries did it? Because there, the twinning project is a slightly project for success. And what's the main difference? Of course, there was a strong interest, politically speaking, by these countries who wanted to come joining the EU to fully implement what you were saying, while for Rwanda, for Senegal, for other countries, Vietnam, with the World Bank, they hadn't had that lever to sort of impose or to make it happen. So that's an interesting, so the politically, I mean, this is also in Latin American states, what they call a standoff states. So only if there is a lot of pressure, they might move. Interesting point to think about. So, and last but not least, I mean, we put some pictures here. So this comes again out of the survey. We asked sort of NSO heads, what would you like to see in terms of training? Not very surprising, technical skills, data science skills, crunching the data, R stuff came out nearly everywhere. But also, as I mentioned, also statistical offices are interested in leadership training. They are interested in teamwork, change management, and strategic planning. So this came out well as well. And there seems to be a gap. That's maybe something for DFID and others to listen to, that we need to have, for instance, new leadership programs. We have had many African leaders that hadn't had any program in terms of being trained. So maybe we could think about of doing this leadership training also for the middle management. The top management maybe has benefited, but the middle management maybe not, and they also need to be trained. Few ideas. So, basically wrapping up, because we have a couple of more speakers. So what I wanted to show you was three things. One, there is really a need to rethink capacity development coming from building to development, and I think we have good arguments to think. We have some ideas about these guidelines. I think we are at a very initial stage. Happy to get your views and feedback. And last but not least, questions to you for the discussion. Do guidelines matter? I mean, will they be picked up by, is it important to have guidelines? Will agencies listen? Will they really sort of listen and implement? And Emily and others. Will they have an impact? Will it have an effect, these guidelines? Do this capacity development framework, do we get it right? I mean, is that a new approach? What is missing? What should be changed? Get your feedback. And then last but not least, it's about this, we basically talked so far about developing capacities of NSO and the NSS system. But shall we not also build capacities for citizens? So for citizens-generated data, not speak about the private sector, that might be a different sort of ball game. But for citizens-generated data as they will come, would that be smart to also have developed guidelines? So I stop here. Thank you so much.
Sure, thank you. So
Okay.
it is, to put you all out of your suspense, it's the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, which is a partnership that was created in 2015 and very much came out of the recommendations of the report that was produced by the Office of the UN Secretary General, the previous Secretary General, A World That Counts. For those of you who are keeping up to date with your data revolution literature, will remember that one. And that report, which was prepared by an expert group of which Johannes was one of the experts and which I was the head of the Secretariat for, recommended that a global partnership be established to act as a sort of connector between the different worlds of data. So not so much to work intensively within the statistical community or within the private sector community, but to act as the sort of pipework that can help to connect them. So that's very much the role that we play. We now have approaching 350 members of our network. John Pullinger, who I'm sure many of you know, is one of our board members, along with the UN Deputy Secretary General, the Vice President of Ghana, the CEO of Plan International. This gives you a sense of the sort of broad breadth of the different stakeholders that we're working with. But I wanted to talk less about the partnership itself here, although very happy to answer any questions afterwards, and just to reflect on the capacity building agenda as we see it, and maybe just add some thoughts from the work that we do within countries. The way that we have a number of different sort of activities at different levels of size of group, a breadth of collaboration involved. But one of the things that we do is work very closely with a self-selecting group of countries who come to us because they're interested in expanding their networks, in modernizing and innovating and kind of seeing what else is out there beyond the boundary of the official statistics community and the kind of official, the official statistics system nationally and internationally. And we work with them to sort of establish their priorities and then see how we can put help from inside and outside our network to put together the different collaborations that will help them to sort of achieve their aims. So one of the big things that we're doing at the moment is working with 5 governments in Africa on something called the Africa Regional Data Cube, which is a project with national statistical offices, but also with NASA and with Amazon Web Services and Google to make satellite imagery more available and more easy to use is the critical thing. It was data that was previously available, but just very difficult technically to use. So making it easier for those statistical offices to use that data. It's an example of the sort of way in which we're trying to foster the relationships outside of the statistical system. So I think there was a number of things sort of reflecting on this, the work that Paris 21 are doing on capacity building 4.0, and I should say I'm a huge fan of this approach and Paris 21 in general. And I just sort of wanted to just offer really a few reflections thinking about our experience. Also, I should say, I was here, I don't know if any of you were here last night for the beverage lecture given by Will Moy, which was really very stimulating and very much about the relationship between, I suppose very broadly put, sort of data and society. So I have added a few thoughts stolen from Will that you will see woven through. The first thing I think is that I think to focus on, it's absolutely critical to focus on capacity building. But I think we shouldn't expect that to solve the problem insofar as there is a problem. If the problem is that if we define the problem purely on the supply side, there isn't enough capacity to produce good statistics, then capacity building is the answer. But I don't quite think that is the problem we're trying to solve. I think the problem we're trying to solve is really the kind of problem that Mary was talking about at the beginning, which is about the use of data within governments and the extent to which decision making is informed by the best possible evidence for the best possible outcomes, for the most effective use of resources, etc., etc. It seems to me that's actually what this is for. In which case, focusing on the supply side is, by definition, only ever going to be part of the problem. The problem, arguably, with statistics is partly that there is a capacity gap in terms of production, but I certainly think from our observations in the countries that we work in, there is an equal, if not greater, problem on the demand side. I also think you can't solve the problem on the supply side only. Even if it were simply a supply side problem, it can't be solved on the supply side. So I think we really have to think about creating much stronger demand for the kind of statistics that we trust and want to produce. And I think that's not necessarily any data. And I think that has two elements that, certainly we see very strongly. The first, exactly as you'd expect, is political buy-in. We put a lot of emphasis in the work that we do with national statistical offices on making links, much stronger links in countries to executive offices, to presidents, to vice presidents, to line ministers, to ultimately those who control the money and who control the systems that produce the kind of incentives that Johannes was talking about. And I think there's a lot, we all crave sort of proof of impact and let's all show, but I think it's also about identifying the right impact. If I've been doing this job now for about, coming up for 2 years actually, and the one thing I think that one of the things I've learned, probably more than one, that I've learned in that time is that if you want to get politicians interested in data, some of you in the room have heard me say this before, but it bears repeating, the very last thing that you should do is talk about the data. Nobody cares about data. What they care about is what they can use the data for in order to do whatever got them elected, whatever they think might get them elected next time. So that's the creating demand. You don't actually have to make them care about data for its own sake. It's nice if they do, but that's not actually the point. The point is, do they think it's useful for them to achieve the thing that they do actually care about, which will be the thing that they will continue to care about, however successful we all are. So I think there has to be a really strong focus on demand side. And I think, it comes down to a number of things. It's relationship building. And it's sort of breaking the boundary. I sort of was looking at my notes about what I was going to say. I think a lot of the things I'm saying are really about things that have to be done at the boundary between the statistical office and other groups and other people. And I think this is really about the boundary between a national statistical office and other parts of government, and thinking much harder about making those boundaries much more permeable. What makes people want to cross those boundaries in different ways? And I know that there is a tension here, because part of the value of a national statistical office is its independence and its separation from the sort of political business of government. And that is a critical value that I think absolutely has to be upheld. But I don't think, that's the part of creating demand is creating demand for the kind of national statistical office that you want to see. And I think that has to be, it's about the kind of making the case for statistics within government and making that boundary between the NSO and other parts of government much more permeable in a way which doesn't jeopardize the ultimate mission of the office. So that's this kind of political reach. I also think, and this is the part that the lecture last night really made me think about, that there is a point about people too. Ultimately, in democratic countries, what politicians care about is what people care about. And you're never, as with politicians, you're unlikely to get people as a whole to care about, people are never going to be marching down Whitehall demanding better data. Well, I doubt it. But I think one can make people, or one could, if we were more thoughtful and proactive about communication, it may be possible, A, you know, in the current climate, to make people less hostile to data than they are, which would be a start. And secondly, I think I think it's kind of more appreciative of the data which is produced, because they see it as something which better reflects their own lives and their own societies. And Will had this really interesting example that he was using yesterday about employment statistics and the sort of, or about the sort of use of headline figures generally. And, you know, the sort of the statistics that people see that make the news, that they think of as the products of national statistical offices, are things like headline employment figures, headline GDP figures, which are completely, you know, which are kind of, either they're just a bit vague and fuzzy and people don't see themselves in them. And quite often, because they're a headline figure, in parts of the country, by definition, they're actually going to be you know, opposite to what people think they are. So, you know, if you live in the northeast and you're told that GDP is growing, you know, 4% a year, well, kind of so what? Your town centre is still closing down. So I think there's something about producing statistics, and again, it's about communication. It's just communication with the public rather than with politicians, about communicating in ways that means that people can see themselves in the data. You're never going to get a majority of people, you know, you're never going to get a kind of the ONS website crashing when the latest data is downloaded because so many people want to see it. But it has happened. It has happened. Okay, I take it all back. But that's great. That's what should be happening. You know, that's exactly what should be happening. So I think there's also a sort of boundary issue here between the ONS and people, and just becoming much better at communicating. So I would add, you know, to your list of the kind of skills, I would put communication right up there. And that's not necessarily, I also think when we think about skills, it's not that everyone who is a good statistician also has to be a good communicator. It doesn't mean the same people have to do these things. It's about, you know, an NSO support, you know, having within it different skills, great statisticians, and also great communicators. And, you know, we shouldn't, it's a bit much to expect somebody to be both. And that does feel like, you know, you are asking too much of people. So I think this first sort of thing that I think is part of the really critical context for the capacity building to get the outcomes that we want from statistical capacity, from data, is this point. I suppose, you know, one can think of it as communication, one can think about it as sort of almost like capacity building outside of the NSO. You know, sometimes we call it data literacy, which is a term I don't find very useful, but it's a kind of, how do we make more people care about data? Those people who have an influence on funding, on uptake, on decision-making care about data. I think that's the first thing. I mean, I had a number of points about donors, but I think those have already been made as well as part of, you know, I think Mary made those points, you know, about the impact of donors as sort of funders and essentially as part of the demand side for data in certain in some contexts, and I, you know, very much agree with that, and we also see that repeatedly from those governments who we work with. A second thing I think about boundaries and the sort of skills and capacity that will help NSOs to become more effective by making by helping them to operate more at the boundary between the NSO and other bodies is again very closely related to skills, and of course you would expect me to say this, but I nonetheless think it's true. It's about partnerships, and it is about the kind of skills and the kind of leadership and incentives offered to staff that encourage a kind of openness to developing partnerships, to building out from an NSO to different data sources, to different, you know, on the input side, and Johannes was talking about it as well, from the point, you know, civil society and citizen-generated data, and we're living in a world where national statistical offices have lost their monopoly on data production, if they ever had it, but they certainly don't have it now. And so there has to be some evolution of sort of skills and capacity within the NSO to handle that new world. It's a different that it's a different environment now, and we can't carry on assuming that somehow the skills that we need are those that exist in an environment where the NSO is the monopoly producer of data, which goes into statistics. That's not the case. Sure, absolutely. So I think that's critical. A third thing I think is really critical, again, is about evolution and change. You know, I think we have to be thinking about the kind of capacity for the demands and demands on NSOs now, and the kind of NSOs that are operating now. But this is a pretty fast-moving world, and that even if you begin a undergraduate or a master's course now in statistics, even by the end of that course, the particular skills that the NSO might be looking for might be different, or the context will certainly be different. So I think we also need to think about capacity building in a context of rapid change, and what that means for the kind of skills and also the kinds of institutions and mindsets and incentives. I mean, I think the point Johannes made about incentives is so important. And that we need to think about that as part of capacity. There's no point in building people's capacity if you then put them in the kind of institution that doesn't give them the incentives to actually use that capacity in the ways that you've intended. So I think we have to think about capacity building of people and skills, but also capacity building at the level of institutional incentives and flexibilities, and I mean the political economy of that within any given context. So I think that there's a kind of evolution and change. So the three things I think, to think about in terms of the sort of the capacity building at the boundary of the NSO is really focus on the demand side, thinking about partnerships and the kind of skills that are required of that, and then thinking about evolution and change. And I think my final point sort of underpinning all this is capacity building for what? Are we assuming that the NSO, the role of the NSO, is going to be kind of continuous and unchanging? Is that what we're building capacity for? Or is the capacity building debate engaging with some of these other really interesting debates about the NSO of the future? Is it going to move more towards, is the sort of proper function for NSOs going to move away from statistical production and more to quality control? Probably a bit of both is always the answer, but what's the balance between the two? What does that mean? So I think the last kind of thing that underpins all of my thoughts and my kind of sense of assessment of the capacity building debate as a whole is we have to keep asking ourselves, building capacity for what? Thank you.
Right, well, thank you very much. So my task is partly to reflect on what we've heard, and maybe say a little bit about some of the things that we're doing in DFID, and maybe try and sort of, as I go through what we're doing at the minute and how we see the challenges, responding to some of the sort of very insightful comments and suggestions. So we've had a very upbeat show from Johannes and something slightly more downbeat from Mary. And then Claire was giving us more, I think, sort of showing how the world is changing and how we need to sort of respond to that. I think when I was thinking about this in advance, there are sort of three things I was thinking that within DFID, how we reflect about how we're learning from what we've done already. So the three things are the need to take account of the political economy, the need to think about user needs, and the need for country ownership. And I think in many ways a lot of these have already sort of been talked about a lot, but I guess maybe just in terms of what that means for me, I guess every country, I mean, statistics are quite political. You're providing information that tells you how things are doing, that can be used in all sorts of different ways, and therefore inevitably statistics means that you need to look at the institutions within a country, and they will differ country by country, and therefore really if you want to build capacity to produce statistics and statistics use, you need to understand that context. Mary was quite challenging in terms of the user needs and suggesting maybe we're not doing terribly well in that, but I think that is actually fundamental, that I think in the past statistical offices have seen their job as being to produce certain numbers, you follow certain methods, there's a sort of like a checklist, so it's all the right quality, and then that's it. But I think increasingly, that's not really good enough. What the numbers are for is very much about meeting user needs. I think there's a lot more thinking, and I think there's a great positive, much more recognition of the importance of evidence and data and understanding what's going on if we're going to make good decisions. So I think that is a sort of general trend which people tend to sort of buy into. The challenge, of course, is how you make it happen. So but you can't get away from the need to meet user needs. I think in terms of country ownership, I think that is one of the lessons we've learned. Well, have we learned? It's an ongoing challenge, country ownership, but I think in some ways the transition from the MDGs, which were by some seen as a little bit of a sort of top-down exercise, to the SDGs, which is much more sort of universal agenda, is opening up opportunities for sort of shared agendas, recognizing the SDGs is meant to be a sort of member state-owned, member state-led exercise, and the UN bodies are there to sort of help support that delivery. But we'll only realize those goals depending on what happens in countries, and it's those country institutions really that are going to be really important in terms of delivering. So within DFID, how do we do capacity building? I think the first thing to say about DFID is it's a very devolved organization, and that makes a lot of sense in the sense that we have presence in quite a lot of countries, maybe about 26 country offices or something to that effect. And the idea of that really is that having people in the country, often drawing in local citizens from the country amongst our staff, that their task is to understand what are the challenges within the country in terms of what's happening, what DFID's doing, what our comparative advantage is, how can we have most impact in terms of our agenda of eradicating extreme poverty and the wider sort of developmental challenges. So I think within that devolved context, and thinking about political economy, having that presence of a country office in principle is a way of trying to be well placed to understand the political economy, the institutions. So if you're going to invest in statistics, in a sense, the challenge is how do we draw upon that expertise? But having that presence, I think, is a big advantage because people in a country are going to have a better idea of what's going on than me sitting in East Kilbride looking at the world. So, so that's an opportunity for country offices. I think some of the things that our country offices have been doing, they do invest in statistics. So one or two examples. Rwanda is probably, I would sort of say, one of our success stories. We've had a sort of sustained support for Rwanda over a period of time. I think some of the conditions in Rwanda are there. So in terms of the user needs, if you go around the line ministries in Rwanda and things like the sort of central bank, these are people who really understand the importance of data. And you've got a situation there where the statistics office has got very good relations there and things work pretty well. And I think DFID support in terms of building capacity there has been a success, building it up. And it is country owned in the sense that DFID's funding has in the past gone through a sort of like a basket fund. So donors get together, put the money in, and that's to support national priorities. And that has sort of paid off. And a lot of government money itself is going into the statistics. So the statistics office is less dependent on donor money, and that's a real success. In a more challenging environment in Afghanistan, again, it's really hard to do a population census there, but we do have a program where they've been doing a sort of rolling program around the different provinces to try to get information, basic socio-demographic information that would substitute for a census. So that's sort of happening, and that's through DFID support. It's another example where we have been investing. So besides our country offices, we also have policy leads. So in a sense, we've got policy priorities, girls and women, nutrition, health, education, all those sort of policy themes. And again, I think there's a sort of distinctive role for those teams within DFID to support statistics, operating more at the international level. So in a sense, what are the international standards? What are the right ways of doing it? What are the sort of tools and processes that can sort of support in countries to generate information? I think those policy leads can help with that, and we do a number of programs. I mean, maybe just mention one where we've seconded someone to the World Health Organization who's working what's called the sort of Health Data Collaborative. And it's a really interesting initiative where they looked at all these health indicators around the world and sort of said, look, there's thousands of them. And they sort of said, well, look, here, for any decent health system, here's 100 indicators that will really give you what you need as a sort of high-level summary of how good your health system is doing. So by getting together different international organizations, they were able to sort of do that. But then in parallel, they've managed to sort of set up within one or two countries, like in Malawi and Kenya, they got a sort of country health data collaborative. And there's an opportunity for local players to come together, using some of the tools and products coming from the international organization, applying them, seeing how does that work, and then feeding that back up to the international level where those tools and processes can be refined. So I think that's an example of how having someone seconded who works with those different groups on an international level, but on a particular sector, can actually drive the agenda forward. And I would see that as being a model that's worth looking at in other areas. Besides our sort of country offices and our policy leads, then there's me and my team, which I sit in the sort of research and evidence division, and we've got a team called Data for Development. And to some extent, our responsibility is to provide overall leadership for DFID's outward-facing programs in terms of supporting statistical capacity building. So how do we do that? Well, I think in terms of how we think of learning within DFID, there's sort of three different aspects to it that are important. So one is leadership. So it says within an organization, if you want to learn, you need very good leadership. There's tools and processes that can help to sort of make things happen, that allow you to sort of share things. And then there's sort of skills and people, that sort of side of things. So I think if you bring those things to how we think about capacity building within where I sit, I think internationally we do actually support global partnerships that we think are really, really important in terms of providing some leadership by bringing different collaboratives together. So we support Paris 21, and you've heard about the things that they are doing. And I think that's a really, really important work. And I think in terms of leadership, I think because of the way the world is changing for statistical offices, those statistical offices themselves need to have really good leadership. So in terms of, if you can have good leadership, that's going to be a key ingredient in an organization that can sort of build its capacity. And to some extent, the challenge is for statistical offices to modernize, to take account of the new opportunities, to deal in very complicated landscapes. And I think Paris 21 has become a sort of trusted voice for statistical offices, and it's got a really important role to play in terms of helping offices move that on. I think the global partnership we've also heard about and what they're doing. And again, DFID also funds the global partnership. And I think again, to some extent, if you're going to have country ownership, you need political leadership. And one of the things that global partnership has been doing is in terms of convening different high-level decision makers who are in a position to sort of set the agendas within countries. So last year I had the privilege of attending a high-level meeting in Nairobi where you got political leaders from Kenya, from Ghana, from Sierra Leone, standing up and sort of making commitments to what they wanted in terms of getting better data that they needed. So again, I think that's really, really important. And that role of bringing different players together that the global partnership plays is really important. Besides that, I guess, in terms of our own priorities, fundamentally, I think national statistical systems continue to have a really, really important role in terms of how we're going to do statistical capacity building. We do have some programs on that, but we're very interested in new ideas. I mean, maybe to give you a couple of examples of things we're doing, we have a program with the IMF, which is really providing technical assistance to quite a number of African countries to build their core capability in terms of producing economic statistics, but in particular about also making that information more openly available and accessible to others. More recently, we've started a new exercise with the Office for National Statistics, otherwise known as ONS. And they're working in 3 different countries, Rwanda, Ghana, and Kenya, to try to do technical assistance there. And I think that's very much looking at the modernization agenda. I think if you look at the ONS and also the UK system, obviously the challenges are different in some ways, but I think the UK system is interesting and it's quite devolved. So some of those challenges of how you join up across the different organizations of the statistical system is something that the UK is probably one of our strengths. And I think also in recent years there's been a very big drive. John Pullinger's brought great leadership within the UK in terms of our own statistical system. And if we can sort of share some of that with the challenging environments in those countries of Rwanda, Kenya, and Ghana, then that program will be really successful. But again, it's thinking about leadership and modernization are 2 of the themes. The other big thing that's changing, I guess, is in terms of digital technology, and that's been spoken about a little bit. Again, we've 1 or 2 programs that we think are helping with that. Mary spoke rather disparagingly about platforms, and there is a proliferation of platforms, but nevertheless, I think we do have what I think is a really, really promising program with the UN Statistics Division, because I think if you've got a platform that allows a country to bring together data and share it with others, it is a very, very important part of the modernization of how you use the technology. The important thing is it's something that the country owns, so it needs to be involved in how it's developed, it needs to have the capacity to run it. But it's also a way, in some ways, of hardwiring into your system some of the underpinning data standards that help ensure the data can be trusted and also making it available to all users. So in a sense, digital technology offers huge opportunities to produce statistics much more efficiently, to get them out, to do great visualizations. So I think helping to do some of that program with UN Statistics Division, I think will help with that. The other thing we're interested in is we've got a program called, I'm not going to tell what this acronym is because it's rather complicated, Grid Cubed. I think it's something like geospatial infrastructure for development data. But basically, it's a number of different experts who are using geospatial data and helping countries to actually access that data and inform decision making. I'm not going to tell you much more about it, but I think it's really, really exciting. And particularly if that's harnessed with a population census, it allows you not only to do a census for the first time, but allows you to draw on wider data sources to keep those estimates live in between. So no longer is the challenge to go around every household, ask the questions, tick the box, put it all together and put it out. The real challenge is how many people live in this country, how is it changing? And if you've got a sort of satellite image showing sort of great big settlement somewhere and your census shows actually, there's just a very small village there, you know that's wrong. And the point is, these numbers aren't perfect, but the challenge is how do you draw these numbers together to make the best possible use of it to inform decision makers. And that's a big step change for Statistical Office. There's technical challenges in doing that, but I think that change in mind shift in terms of what that implies for how the Statistical Office needs to see its role is going to be really, really important if Statistical officers stay relevant. And I think programs like that actually can help to do it by sort of doing these things in practice.
Good afternoon to everybody. I'm speaking to you from Washington, D.C., in one of the offices of International Financial Corporation. My regular job is down the street with the World Bank. I work there in the Development Research Group, and I also have a part-time appointment teaching at the Harvard Kennedy School. Between those two institutions, I've spent much of the last decade or so engaging with big questions around implementation. And so much of our debate and discussion in international development circles centers around this policy versus the merits of that policy. And then once we have a conversation structured around policy, then from the more researchy kind of side, then that's followed up with a group of evaluators who come in with various different methodological tools and then try and give a thumbs up or down verdict on whether that particular policy, program, or project did what it was supposed to do. But our work has been really centered on the black box, as it were, the mechanisms connecting the intervention of one kind or another with the outcomes that it's set up to try and achieve. And what we observe around the world is that there are plenty of places where policies in principle are actually pretty good. Even pretty general ones like make sure you deliver the mail, make sure kids are in school up at least until primary school, preferably through to secondary school. And even when those are being achieved, there's still a huge gap between what people are supposed to be doing, but what actually happens. And so in education, for example, it's just a tragic tales of so many countries where many high percentages of young kids are actually in school every day, but they're not really learning anything. And even in a high middle income country like Malaysia, where I spent much of the last 3 years, the OECD data shows that pretty much half of the 15-year-olds in Malaysia, a high middle income country, can still struggle to do the equivalent of read a headline on a newspaper or do double-digit subtraction. So there's this huge gaps between what countries aspire to do, what they claim to do, what they've signed up to do in the case of the Sustainable Development Goals, all sorts of things that governments claim to be in the business of doing, but yet are unable or unwilling to be able to do that. And our particular concern is with the ability part. There can be all sorts of political reasons why governments might not be able to do a lot of or constrain what they're supposed to be doing. But in those situations where good people are showing up for work every day to try and do their thing, so oftentimes the systems they're working within, or sometimes even especially the systems of the international aid organizations themselves, are part of the problem, not part of the solution. They constrain what people can do. They're designed very centrally, often with very little actual engagement with the idiosyncrasies of the country context, and that just has huge consequences then for the legitimacy of the whole exercise, for the ability of people to actually interpret what's required of them, and then even more basically just to show up for work every day and actually do that kind of work. From a statistical point of view, there's been data collected over the best part of 2 or 3 decades now that provides aggregate level measures, some of it very subjective, about the capabilities of governments around the world to do their central tasks, whether that be in law enforcement or in honoring contracts or in just being generally effective in delivering for their citizens. There's a whole array of different organizations that have set up data sets of one kind or another to try and assess progress or lack thereof on those measures. And in a book that I published last year with my 2 Kennedy School co-authors called Building State Capability, Evidence, Analysis, Action, we have the first chapter is spent really documenting the state of state capability around the world, and shows rather alarmingly, we think, that at least according to the existing data as we have it, only a handful of countries, only about 10 developing countries in the world, are actually on a path to becoming as good as the bottom end of the OECD countries. So we usually say that's Portugal, but it's the idea of Portugal rather than actually Portugal. But if you're as good as Portugal, you can still be an OECD country and still have that sort of level of functionality. And we then sort of document, just using back of the envelope extrapolations. How long is it going to take Guatemala? How long is it going to take Ukraine? How long is it going to take Mali to get at their current pace of change to a level where they can implement it at a level at which the world would regard as minimally acceptable? And unfortunately, many countries are on hundreds, in some cases even thousands of years kinds of trajectories, which are just fantastical kind of numbers. And so we use this to sort of alert people to the very serious problems there are in the world with the willingness and ability of the prevailing administrative systems of government to do their particular tasks. And that's relatively easy to do, relatively easy to do in those sectors where there happens to be good aggregate outcome data on the capabilities of those systems. And health and education happen to be areas in which it's relatively possible now to be able to give countries a benchmarked sense of where they are. And in a better world, we'd also be able to explore this subnationally, because there is not only big variation between countries, there's huge variation within countries, geographically and demographically, with regards to how well they can actually do the kinds of tasks that are being asked of them. So I've read over the 4.0 framework, and I was a participant in one of the earlier meetings in Paris where these general ideas around the capabilities of statistical agencies to do their work is being discussed. And I don't have any particular comments on the framework per se. It's just a very long categorization of different elements. I think from the approach that we take in our book, it's really a sort of, how do you prioritize where to enter amongst all of the possible ways in which the breakdowns in the systems can occur? How do you figure out how to nominate and prioritize which of those problems is actually going to be the most locally legitimate and actionable entry point? And as experts, as people with PhDs, as people that like to think that their job is to help other people solve problems, it's very tempting for World Bank officials in particular, but for others as well, to think that we'll solve what we can, we'll do what we know how to do. And so we find ourselves essentially in a solution selling space. We have a particular tool, a particular technique, a particular thing that we've developed over our careers that we like, of course, and we're comfortable with it. So we think that becomes the proverbial nail for which we happen to have the hammer. But I think a large part of the challenge that we identify with implementation around the world is that that's too often the way in which things are done generally, is that the international agencies generally see themselves as the conduits for or the disseminators of something called a best practice. And so the idea being that if countries adopt the best practice, that they too will then come to have levels of functionality that correspond to that adoption. But I think we're able to show pretty convincingly, I think, that the adoption of the cut and paste kind of approach to doing everything from constitutional reform through to budgeting through to education reform, these things are like grafting skin. They're just like taking from one place to another, and they have it takes a lot of things to be right for those transplanting processes to occur. Now, for the statistical space, I think what that really means is that it's sort of a doubly vexed situation, because we simultaneously need a lot of data to be able to do the kind of work that we need to do, to be able to track and trace the extent to which performance capabilities are changing over time. That's a large part of that does require a strong investment in data. But it's doubly problematic, I think, because we're in a world in the 21st century where we've placed enormous expectations on developing country governments in particular to deliver all sorts of things for their citizens, and through social media and other forms of engagement, citizens themselves just have now vastly higher expectations of what their governments should be able to do for them. They see what their neighboring countries are getting, or they just can, at a click of a few mouse strokes, learn what a truly well-functioning system looks like. And when their lived experience is so vastly different from what they see other people in the world or countries like them experiencing, that's just a recipe for deep political discontent. And so this expectations experience gap, as we call it, the gap between what citizens are told to expect or come to expect, or which their governments have codified if they are a signatory to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which have fantastical kinds of targets with regards to improving health and education and justice and transport and all the other things that governments do. When that gap gets too big, and then governments decide to get initially serious about responding to that, certainly what I saw and experienced in Malaysia was this very powerful pressure to demonstrate progress, to keep everybody happy, to show ministers that yes, indeed, the prevailing administrative apparatus responsible for improving foreign investment is in fact improving foreign investment. And when you put enough political pressure on a system to realize these kinds of objectives, then statistical ministries become agents of providing all sorts of fake news. In effect, they've just become ways in which you generate whatever number keeps the political moment satisfied. So there, as you know far better than I, there's just so many different tasks that data has to perform, from the very funding of it, from the authorizing of it, to the collecting of it, to the curating of it, to the making it, to having the veracity and the certifiability of it be discerned, to having it then be able to be disseminated. So again, in Malaysia, to use my own experience there, data itself is pretty good quality, except it's guarded with nuclear code levels of secrecy, and so it's only released and very selectively, even to organizations like the World Bank, let alone to academic researchers who might want to use that to do what might subsequently show that some things aren't actually working as well as they might think they are. So the particular approach that we stress is really centered around being problem-driven rather than solution.
Could I say 2 more minutes, do you think?
Yep, sure. So the juxtaposition that we try to draw is seeing ourselves less in the business of being about selling solutions to people and being in the best practice world of disseminating all of these things, but really trying to help people to nominate and prioritize their own problems. And so if I was doing a PDAA type analysis, the type of analysis that we recommend in our book, it would be, look, there's so many different ways in which this whole statistical apparatus in country X is being compromised right now, is just unable to do what it's supposed to be doing. I could probably nominate things that I think are pretty important and that might need to be done. But I think the kind of approach that we would stress in every problem that we encounter, but especially in this particular one, would be, let's just start with trying to help the prevailing system do a slightly better job than what it's already doing. And so that would entail quite intensive and extensive work with the particular statistical ministries to say, across that whole grid that you lay out in that particular 4.0 framework, which of those particular places do you think is actually simultaneously sort of the most salient one for the government right now, or for you as the custodians of this particular data? And what's a reasonable set of expectations about what a solution to that problem might look like? And how can we go about actually doing the kind of work that would help to discernibly show that progress had been made in responding to that particular program, so that particular problem. So keeping on putting the work back onto the people themselves to be able to address these problems in ways that reflects what they themselves have their mandate to do, but also doesn't rely as much on the expertise of outsiders coming in as much as the legitimacy that outsiders might be able to bring to helping people as domestic actors do what they're already supposed to be doing. So in the short version, that's pretty much what I have to say about it, but there are obviously further details, and if you care to engage with that, you can type building state capability into our friend Google, and it will bring you up to our website at the Kennedy School, where both a free copy of the book and a whole range of country case studies can be made available to you for free to be able to see what some of this looks like in a more granular detail. Thank you very much.
Jim Todd. I work at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and I work mostly in Tanzania. And it was nice to see the sort of way that the argument was developed by the different speakers, going from the situation a long time ago when national statistical offices, I assume NSO means national statistical offices, does it?
Yeah.
Wasn't explained totally, but I picked that one up, so I thought I did well there. Operated some time ago until sort of like building in this idea of trying to disseminate the data, get it out to other people and things like that. But I noted down at the beginning a couple of things which I thought might have been addressed, which were partially. Academic institutions, I think, are a force where they can analyze data in different ways, and they're not necessarily part of that orthodoxy that we get from that. And second part was the civil society. And I think it was Neil actually mentioned, was it Neil who mentioned, that the need for this political economy and the users and the ownership, but by whom? And data provide us with answers, but it's not the answers that we need, it's who asks the questions. Unless that data can be disseminated to other people outside of the political orthodoxy, then I think we're not going to get to the answer of where we go with development in this area. And I think that's the key thing, and I think openness of data, enabling the data to get out into academic users, into civil society, so that they can ask their own questions about the data and not just rely upon the political orthodoxy there. I don't know whether that's a thought or a question or whatever. But,
thank you very much. Yeah, I think that they're very pertinent questions. So the role of academics essentially and the need for open data, and we've heard quite a lot about rather a lot of closed data, I think. So who would like to respond to either or both of those on the panel? Go on, Neil.
Well, if I could have a go, I think what you said is really, really important, and I would say within DFID, but more generally, there's been an increased emphasis on open data with a view to sort of putting it out there. And I think in terms of this point about the need to meet user needs, I think it is the expert analyst, I think, has got a really, really important role in terms of mediating between the sort of policy questions, if you like, and the sort of like the supply of data. So in a sense, it's how you manage up. I mean, in terms of who owns it, I mean, I think the idea, to a large extent, a country's government will sort of set the policy agenda, and so that you expect the national statistics system to respond to those needs. But the information, the data, according to like the fundamental principles of statistics, is a public good, and it should be open and made openly available. And in some of our previous programs, we found we would help the data to be collected, but then there was a sticking point in terms of not making it available. So there's been much more emphasis on our side in terms of getting the data out there, but I think we could probably do more to tap into the expert user. And I think your point about the role of academic institutions and civil society is a really good one, and thinking about how you might stimulate their use and the role they can play to add value to the data, to bring it to life, and to some extent do some of that dissemination in terms of explaining to others what it means.
Can I say
Yes,
something?
Mary, go on.
Just going back to this question of users, I think we
You may need to speak a
we
little
may
more
be
loudly.
we may be mistaken in thinking there's a whole bunch of expert users out there able to grab the data that we disseminate in the form of macrodata and turn it into something useful. And I was pleased to hear Neil talk about the success in Rwanda, because we were there for about, I think, 12 years. And almost every cycle of 3 years, we do a substantial amount of training with people outside the stats office to help them try to learn to use the data. Now, this was a more difficult task than it was building capacity inside the NSO. And I think, you know, we're underestimating the amount of effort that will need to go into producing a really strong number of expert users in the kinds of countries that we're talking about. It's not a matter of just putting the data out there and someone's going to go and say, hey, thank goodness, here it is, I'm running off with it. But it's more like Marks and Spencer's ladies' clothes. You know, the data's there, but no one's wanting to buy it. So we're going to have to do a lot more.
All right. Johannes, did you want to?
Sure. I also, for the sake of animating a little bit of discussion, I tend to slightly disagree in terms of the demand side, and I wanted to bring in another strand that we have mentioned in bypassing, but we haven't given it as much attention, where the demand comes from. I mean, your point about is anybody sort of interested in data? I mean, where should it come from? Your point about the academics and civil society. So, I mean, let's be very clear. We have 2015, the heads of state have agreed on the SDG. 17 goals, 169 targets, 240 unique indicators. This is the big issue in many countries I'm traveling to implement the SDG data framework. So these countries are desperately looking around to find the data that is needed to monitor and measure the SDGs. So there is now a huge communities out there in nearly all countries, from rich to poor, from low capacity to others, to find that data that will respond. Now the question is, the real question is, do these people are interested in looking for data that is important for that given country, let's say because we have used Tanzania and Rwanda, and they look for inequality that matters for Tanzanian people, or what we heavily criticize, what the whole international machinery is about these days, the UN machinery and stuff, is trying to produce data that goes into a data portal in New York, from which we produce a global report that the UN Secretary General will does sort of present once in a year and shows this is where we are with global monitoring and global estimation of the SDGs. So, and then researchers can come and crunch their analysis and time series analysis and saying, okay, Tanzania is not so good. But does that help? The original idea was to localize the SDGs, and there are a lot of civil society organizations that want to do stuff, and then I want to do, even with here in the local area, that want to have data that makes a difference for the people. So we have a framework, we have expressed demand, so let's use that demand to make change.
Now, I know Matthew is very keen to say something, so if I can let Matthew have his say. Right.
Go ahead.
Oh, I guess I think the reason I think that you're seeing that demand is because you're walking into statistics offices, and often to the office within the statistics office which has SDGs on the door. I think if you went into a school or an office of an education administrator or a hospital, finding data for the SDGs would not be their first priority. I've just come back from Nigeria yesterday, and we were talking to a lot of educational planners and the commissioners of education in some of the Nigerian states. And their priorities for data are things like, of these teachers I have, how many are actually there in the schools? Of these, which other schools I have which don't have blackboards? What's the pupil-teacher ratio in each different school? These are their data priorities. And there's, and I think in terms of what we're now talking about, the data ecosystem. The data ecosystem is not just, of course, about producing data. It's about these people who we're hoping will use data, and will then be the people who, because they're using it and valuing it and actually making a difference with decisions they're making, will then feed back and support the collection of data. And I don't think that you can have a sustainable, high quality, regular production of data unless it's being used. I mean, just one anecdote, I used to work in consumer prices. And you see within a statistics office, whenever you move anybody into consumer prices, they start performing better because everybody knows what that data is used for. Everybody is using it. The taxi driver knows what you're talking about if you talk about consumer prices. And I think it's the same throughout the statistics office. So you have that cycle in the data ecosystem of production, use, difference, support, all going around. And for prioritizing, you need to know where in the cycle, where in that cycle in each particular country is the place to intervene to make things better. And again, in most of the countries that I go to, that place, every country there are complaints about lack of data. Every country there are complaints about poor quality data. And every country they are not making a full use of the data which they have. And so I think the quickest win, the quickest way into building improving a statistical ecosystem and building capacity there is very, very often in that thing of making use of the data that we already have, rather than starting at the end of, well, what do we need in this NSO? How should we organise the NSO? How should we be starting from that end?
Okay, thanks, Matthew. Anyone from outside? No, Claire, did you want to?
Well, it's almost the same point.
Yeah.
Just to emphasise what Michael was saying, the subnational data is very often the essence of generating demand within the country. There are not that many people who really care, apart from the headlines, how far up and down the league tables their country is. But they do care whether province A or province B is the right place to put resources for a particular thing. So it's the subnational element that is important and that can be really difficult to extract, I think.
Although, of course, the SDGs in principle, whether in practice is a different matter, but in principle they are supposed to disaggregate by region, of course. So, you know, in principle we should be able to have those data, but whether in practice we'll have them, I don't know. But
there is, just on that point, there's a really interesting bit of research in a paper that's produced recently by Alice Evans, who's a researcher at King's College. She has done some research on data use in the health service in Zambia, and by kind of looking at the data, but also a lot of interviews with policymakers and practitioners, really her conclusion is that the kind of rankings really did succeed in Zambia in driving, or at least one factor that was important in driving really quite considerable reductions in maternal mortality rate in quite a short time, because the fact that Zambia was doing worse than its neighbours when you looked around had two effects, but it was interesting because what she identified was sort of two equal and opposite effects. One, clearly the kind of we can't be seen to be lagging, and it kind of became more of a political agenda, but also the galvanising effect of seeing what's possible in countries that are not so different to your own. So there was a kind of sense, there was both a negative sort of impetus in terms of we can't, for our national pride, we can't be seen to be at the bottom of the league table, but also a sort of positive impetus there around, and actually this shows that it's possible in countries that are not miles away from us. It's not just so I thought that was really interesting around, one sort of anecdote around the potential impact of league tables, and exactly the kind of SDG approach, which essentially is lining up countries and saying, these are the countries that are doing well, these are the countries doing badly, this is what it all adds up to. So I sort of think, that does speak to me in defence of this. I mean, just to kind of step into this sort of to SDG or not to SDG kind of debate. I mean, I think I sort of in a sense feel like we don't want to get too carried away with the sense that there's kind of two separate agendas here. That the SDG monitoring agenda is one which many governments are taking very seriously, and which for some statistical offices, like in Ghana, for example, are using in a phenomenally effective way politically to generate extra resources, extra capacity, which is going to benefit the whole statistical office. They have a government who happens to be very invested in the SDGs and is, is sort of seeing the SDGs as an important part of their kind of foreign policy almost, as part of their leadership within the region and globally. And the Ghana Statistical Service, who happens to have people in it who are phenomenally kind of politically savvy and are using that in a very intelligent way to say, okay, well, if that's what you want, then this is what we need. And that's going to have benefits right through the system, not just in the little pocket that is the SDG office. So I think there are really smart ways of doing it. There are also, I'm sure, countries where those priorities are distorting and taking away from important agendas. But the point is to say, I think for me, the point is to say, look, the SDGs are a political opportunity. They seem to be consistently, and for longer than perhaps some of us might have feared, be having an effect to shine a spotlight on data. So that's a political opportunity. We should use it.
I'll come back to you. Just let me check in whether there's anybody else who would like Garnet. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Garnet Compton from the Office of National Statistics, and I've recently been doing some work in with the Ethiopian census. And I was curious to know around the capacity building, is there any link or success in terms of the sharing of capacity between countries that are neighbouring or in similar rankings on these numerous scales we've talked about as a successful approach to capacity building?
I mean, that's certainly. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead. I mean, I do think that is certainly one of the things that I think it's too early to say success, but certainly one of the things that I've noticed just among the groups of countries that we work with is that kind of sitting, we work with 5 countries in Africa, and it feels like for them sitting together and discussing priorities and, issues and sort of the things they're doing just feels very open and natural and very comfortable. And it's a conversation that is a very sort of open and feels like the natural sort of way, the place where they feel comfortable having those discussions, being quite open, sharing knowledge things. So I wouldn't go so far as to say I've got any dramatic success stories, but from what I've seen of the different kinds of global, regional, national groupings that we bring together, that feels to me like the one where the most serious, productive conversations are happening, at least in our network. So I would think that's probably going to be the case, but that's where we'll get impact too.
Mary.
Yeah, I want to speak for Paris 21 here and jump in if it's your show really, but I mean, Paris 21 developed the statistical peer reviews, which was when 2 nations, including policymakers, then reviewed the statistical system of another nation. And one of the most effective components of that was to be able to compare and contrast, and particularly the policymakers to say, look, we're doing this differently in Ghana or Tanzania or South Africa. Why can't you do it here, guys? And that kind of pressure to pressure, data user to data user was actually quite effective, as well as the statistician to statistician. I don't know whether you want to say some more about what happens these days, but
yeah, I can just add. I mean, on your quite interesting question about the South-South learning and the learning and the interest, and so there is now this. I mean, it has been mentioned once. Is the Cape Town Action Plan on Development Data? This is the United Nations. I mean, I'm speaking now like a UN agency. But I believe in it, in the sense that the United Nations Statistical Commission is where all the countries are meeting once a year and discuss about priorities. And this plan, this Cape Town Action Plan, has been endorsed by this commission. So, and it has one of the 6 pillar items is about capacity development and building. So I think there are ongoing learning exercises. I mean, Claire mentioned a few, and you mentioned a few that are there. But I think it isn't yet done in a very systematic way in terms of thinking. I mean, I think you have to have a framework, for instance, on leadership skills training. And we are doing this we have done it in Africa. We are now doing it in Asia. But it should be sort of lessons learned. This is for the senior leader management, how to be done for middle management, and then sort of go out. Political economy is the issue that has come up very recently, how to deal with this. That would be very interesting to learn sort of peer review learning. And I think it would be, in particular on those new items we haven't yet established this peer review. On the sort of more classical stuff, you mentioned some of the more classical stuff that you're also familiar with, that has been there, but on the new stuff, not yet. So work to be done.
Okay. Jim, did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, because I was thinking this discussion about SDGs. Yeah, SDGs, 259, was it, or indicators? Absolutely.
Only
necessary.
244.
244, just absolutely necessary for everybody to collect those. But unless the local capacity to build in the number of blackboards or the number of teachers using is built into maybe to countries or to even states or even just to districts to collect those local data that they need to answer their questions, unless that's built into the system, that flexibility, then I don't see that people are not going to use it. People are not going to say, oh, well, I'm going to look that up because I want to look at indicator number 246, not 244. But they want to answer the questions that they have about their systems. And that's what Michael was saying, that, governments lock down that data with all sorts of codes. They might allow those SDG indicators to come out, but they don't allow you to go in and find out how many blackboards are being used by teachers in one particular district. And that is, I think, crucial to making data success, is building that granularity in there and building that local response to local questions. Otherwise, governments are going to lock it down and not allow them, and that's what I think is the problem.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Can I just react on this? Because I think also on a positive note, I mean, we are 3 years into the SDGs. For the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, the data was only coming in 6, 7, 8 years after we agreed. The leaders agreed, and they signed something which I didn't really realize. And then 5, 6 years later, oh, we don't have any data. And then they started to up. They created Paris 21. They created the World Bank, sort of very different programs. Now we have data up front. So for those of you who will be going, maybe Claire will be going to the HLPF, the High Level Political Forum, for the first time, countries are begging to show their voluntary national reviews. That is the sort of a framework document. How good is the UK, Germany, Tanzania doing in implementing the SDGs? And then it depends on the specific countries. And some countries take it very seriously to produce these national voluntary review with civil society, with business, with a local level. And some countries just ask a consultant, write it for me, and present it. Interestingly enough, if you look at the VNRs, when they're presented in New York, the first thing everybody is complaining, we don't have the data. So every country is saying we don't have the data. So in that sense, problem realized, and as Claire said, I think it's the first time that this issue is coming so to the fore. Now we have to, fully agree. We have now to ride the wave and hopefully get more resources and use this political momentum so to bring the data agenda and statistics agenda forward. It's the opportunity now.
Okay, now we were due to finish at 4:30, but I don't think unless people are desperate to rush off at this point. The audience can rush off at any time, but the speakers are slightly more trapped. But I know, Dev, you wanted to ask a question, so if everyone's happy to stay a bit longer. Yeah, Dev.
There's a point generally following up with Matthew's line of that local sort of data literacy and so on. And I think it's very important actually that people who are providing the data also get fed back. This is how the data, and just an example of when I was in Mozambique a few years ago, and we went out to a local district and went to the education and the health department, so they're providing data to the centre, and so they were filling in these forms each year, and I just sat with them and I said, let's have a look at these. Do you actually look at the figures to see what you provided last year and what the actual outturn was? So they were providing a projection for a number of school children expected next year and so on. And every year there was an overestimate because of particular reasons. But they never looked at it in that way. And they never had feedback from how the figures were used at the high level. And I think with the SDGs, we need to have that mechanism, how do we feed the data back to where it's coming from, so they understand the usefulness of it. The other point, just in terms of this sort of event, I think, just a thought I had. I'm part of the development section, so I think it's a thought for us to think about for a future event, perhaps, that we're all talking about various countries that have had experience in, and what we're talking about them. Next time with this technology, we should have some of them actually joining in as well, so that we can get them involved. We're talking with them, not just about them.
Yeah, although, in principle, of course, if they knew about the event, they could join in, and that's why we've got the remote connection. But I mean, what you say is absolutely right, of course. I mean, I just have one comment for everybody, because thinking about this slightly as an outsider, we've had a sort of contrast between developing countries and developed countries, or so-called developing countries and so-called developed countries. And yet, it seems to me that quite a few of the things that you've all been talking about apply as much in the UK as they do in Uganda or Rwanda. And particularly the demand for data. We know in all developed countries that the demand for data is often a very political issue, and often people don't want to know. So the demand for data is not necessarily there in developed countries as well as in developing countries. So it seems to me it's not a problem that's particular to developing countries, and that maybe there are actually things that developed countries will be able to learn from developing countries. It's not necessarily a poor country problem, it seems to me.
I suppose it's partly to do with resources. So developed countries relatively are a lot better resourced. So I think in principle some of the challenges are very common. You're right there. But I think if you look at a statistical office in a developing country, typically the opportunity for them to do a good job is actually really, really hard if they are really, really under-resourced, if they're not supported, and if they're at the behest of donors to come in and do what donors ask them to do. So I think there's a sort of there is a sort of step change, but it doesn't mean sort of say some of the underlying issues at a different sort of level of intensity do apply. And certainly some of the new challenges of the opportunities of new data sources is a big challenge to our own Office for National Statistics in the UK. But actually it's a sort of, in developing countries, they see it as a sort of an existential threat. Perhaps, well, I think we do as well actually in the UK, but it's probably more of a real threat whenever you're a body that is really under-resourced and at risk of being bypassed. So I think each country is different, but I wouldn't like to overstate the similarities in terms of the degree of challenge.
Anyone else like to respond to my provocation?
I think I might, but I want to just go back to Mike's point for a moment about choosing the one thing that matters. And I'm wondering if we're beginning to ask too much of statistical offices. So the international demands, are these drowning out the key salient priorities of people trying to run governments and systems in countries? Should we perhaps be thinking, this is a radical suggestion that I've just kind of thought of, let the international community get on with collecting the data that they need, and maybe this is where big data and new technologies come in, and allow national statistical systems to start to respond to the immediate policy needs that Matthew was talking about, the needs of statistics on prices, GDP, trade. Those kind of things got pushed to the side for a long time. So I'm wondering if we're just asking too much of national offices, and whether we should have this rather two-speed system. I don't know.
Michael, are you still there? Because if you
yes, I am. I can just speak briefly to both of those points. Actually, I'm sympathetic to that. I work for a part of the World Bank that exists in some sense to do. We work particularly on poverty data. Okay, so that a lot of that comes from household surveys, and our personal and professional interests are to maximize comparability, because we want to be able to look at when a country like Bolivia makes a claim about whether poverty's gone up or down, but that has to mean something similar-ish to what Pakistan says and to what Mali might say. So what we as data professionals want is fidelity on comparability, and that may or may not be, as the previous speaker just said, what comports with what national priorities might be. Moreover, when we, the World Bank, are doing surveys or even using other people's surveys, most of those are designed to be nationally representative. So they're sampled as such to be able to elicit a number that can then be put into these big league tables or these summary tables in big annual reports and the like. But again, you don't need me to tell you that this kind of the sampling strategy you need to be able to do serious subnational work is just a level of granularity and scale and sophistication that itself requires high levels of capability, but also just raw resources in order to be able to do that. So I'm very sympathetic to this idea that there is, in an ideal world, there's complementarity, but in a real world, I think there's often quite serious trade-offs between what's good for the international community and what's good for the national policy-making apparatus. And with my own sort of personal norms hat on, I think I want to prioritize what's good for the nation. I want a country to be able to do a better job at being able to manage itself, and if that happens to then yield numbers that we can put into our global tables for dissemination, so be it. But I think we do need to, the capability issue is really salient in that. On the question of whether the ministries of rich and poor countries are sort of relatively have similar kinds of problems with data, I don't know, as one other person just said, I think this is when you just on a sheer numbers of bodies that show up for work every day to do this work, the computing power they have at their disposal, the resourcing and the frequency with which there are other bodies within the broader political apparatus that require numbers to be able to verify and assess a policy proposal. And I think there clearly is, for me at least, a vastly more sophisticated and more routinized structure of data collection in rich countries, which is not to say they're perfect. And in the United States, of all places, right now, it's very clear that numbers, you get whatever you want. But that's a separate. I think that's a different order of problem, just to the raw production of minimally good quality data. I'm not sure if he's even in the room, but if Morten Jervin was here, I think it would be very good reading to have a look at his book from a few years ago called Poor Numbers, which was a very depressing tale of looking at the system of national accounts. This is a UN mandated system that's been around for 4 to 5 decades now, and just if there was a strategy for having a nationally comparable and mandated and vetted set of data procedures, it would be in the data that's used to determine the gross national product of countries around the world. And Morton's sort of anthropological look inside the sausage machines that produce those kinds of numbers are very dispiriting case for just how much room for improvement, to put it politely, there is in much of the work in which there is decades of experience at being able to do this in a lot of developing countries. So that's in the core economic number that sort of is the one that everybody sort of wants and can use to determine or correlate with a whole bunch of other things. But once you're out into indicator number 213 in the Sustainable Development Goals, what level of capability Papua New Guinea is going to be able to provide you on that particular indicator compared to what Sweden's going to be able to provide, I think there's orders of magnitude difference between those two.
Yes, well, I think the point I was making was not about the supply, it was about the demand. I think that the problems of the demand for statistics in developed and developing countries are in some ways similar. I absolutely agree that the supply issues are very, very different in the two kinds of countries, but we do see very widely policy-based evidence and not evidence-based policy all across the world. And from that point of view, I think there are some similarities if we're concerned about the demand for statistical information. So that's really why I was trying to point out that perhaps some of the problems are similar in different kinds of countries. But
can I just sort of add to this? This opens another box of Pandora, which we should have another seminar on, but I fully sort of share. I mean, my main concern of these days is that I work for the OECD. Well, I work at the OECD. We are a hosted partnership. And the DNA of the OECD is evidence-based policy making. So the whole sort of grain and how we are trained is to collect information, collect good data, quality data, you give it to the policymaker, and he will be very happy to use that best data to make the best policy decision. Now, in this world of, I think we have to realize, we are in a completely different world since 2 or 3 years now, a very disruptive different world where many people would sort of very question the official statistics coming out from the ONS, coming out from the Statistician, even if it's the best statistics in the world according to our own best standard criteria. I would say, I don't believe you. It's about fact versus feelings. And if the feelings come into the game, and this is true for developing country, poor country, rich countries, regardless in this world, in Philippines, in Switzerland, We had our main meeting in the Bern in Switzerland, and the main consequence, and to sort of make a long story, sort of coming back to capacity development 4.0, and here I think the term 4.0 hits the nail in my view, is that he said he has asked his office, it's a small country, Switzerland, very, very educated people, and he has sort of mandates his people to go to the user communities, to talk to them, to explain, sort of not to spend all the time in the office to produce the data that later on people say, I don't trust you anyway. The crime statistics go down in Germany, and somebody else says Germany is going up. So we have to relate to alternative facts, fake news, and all those kind of things. So that means a very different way of how we communicate, how we engage with all these user groups. So in that sense, on the demand side, I very much agree with you.
Any other comments from Claire? Did you want to?
No, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. I suppose just one tiny comment. I mean, I absolutely agree with everything that's been said about the sort of differences in capacities and the difficulties that poses. And I think I suppose I haven't entirely given up on the sort of hope that in some cases we may be able to see some sort of leapfrogging and, you know, get some systems, not everything. There's a kind of basic foundational framework which is going to be the same and which has to happen in the same way. But I think, you know, everyone has the kind of history of the, you know, the sort of example of the mobile phones in the back of their minds. And while that's still the only example that anyone has about leapfrogging, which should give us some pause for thought, it does, you know, it's something, I think, given the kind of plethora of innovation here, and, you know, you talked about grid cubed and some of these things, you know, I think it's something that we should hold out as one of a number of different pathways.